I'm not actually sure what I can say to follow that, to be quite honest. But I will give it a good shot. Tracy, that was incredible and powerful, and I think you talked about the devastation of prison in a way that was really meaningful to everybody. But I think for me particularly, you talked about and really showed the power of story and the importance of being human together. And that's really what I want to talk about, but in a completely different way. I don't think what you're going to find from what I say quite as moving, but I guess I'm going to just have to sit with that and know that what I'm doing has a different purpose. And the gaze has shifted, I guess, from the people we work with in the prison setting back to what we can do as professionals, and how we can bring research and practice closer together. And I guess what we know from research is that there's been plenty of research conducted over the last sort of 50 years or so, which talks about the challenges for children and families who've experienced parental imprisonment and the consequences. And even though that research has been kind of quite patchy, the findings are quite consistent. And we know that the outcomes for, and Tracy talked about this really, really eloquently, the outcomes for children are negative and long lasting. Now we all know that. And I guess what I want to talk about is how we can really face the challenge, not to do more research, but to ensure that the findings from the research that we've conducted actually have a meaningful impact. So I'm going to very quickly just talk about some key research trends, but focus more on talking about collaboration and co-creation and sharing of our knowledge. So these are just some very basic stats on imprisonment rates and the numbers of children whose parents are in prison in a couple of countries across the globe. Interestingly, being from Australia, the Australian stats are almost the hardest to find. We rely a lot on guesswork in Australia. So the 40,000 children in Australia is an absolute definite guesstimate. I suspect it's quite a lot higher than that. So we know that on a global scale, the numbers of parents being imprisoned are increasing. We know that the number of children being affected is increasing, and yet this group remains quite hidden and marginalised, really flying under what I would call the radar of general public concern. And interestingly, we did a piece of research in Victoria and New South Wales over the last few years, and again, this is a bit of a guesstimate, but it would seem like somewhere around only 10% of children actually have access to services that they need. So there's a huge unmet need out there, and again, I know I'm preaching to the converted. And again, these stats are not anything new, but it was really, I just wanted to remind people about the scale of the problem that we're all dealing with. But I also want to step back from the scale, and I want to take a small view, and I want to take just 3 minutes of your time to talk a little bit about Harry's life. So if we can run the video, that would be great. Hopefully. Fingers crossed. Aha.
Life was ordinary. Mum told me the night before that she was going to go to jail, but I'd heard her and Raymond, her boyfriend, talking about it, so I knew it was going to happen. I went to court with Mum, but I wasn't allowed to sit with her. She was in the dock. Before she got sentenced, they told her life story, all stuff that had happened to her. I didn't know some of this before. I felt a bit angry. I only had to move next door to stay with Raymond, but it felt like a big move. Everything changed, the rules were different. Instead of being first in the shower, I'd have to wait for Kylie. That's Raymond's daughter, and she'd be in there for ages, and sometimes I'd be late for school. Kylie was mean to me sometimes too. One time she was cooking cheese on toast, and I went to make some too. I opened a new packet of bread because the old one only had a crust left. Kylie said, "Dad said we have to use all the bread before we open a new packet." I told her I didn't like the crust, but she says, "You should be grateful. It was just a piece of toast." I visited Mum every week and she rang me every night. Sometimes I heard arguments between Mum and Raymond on the phone. Mum was at Tarrangara. Raymond sometimes didn't want to spend money on petrol to drive up to the country to prison. That made me pretty angry. I wanted to see Mum, and this was the only way I had. When I visited, we'd sit and talk outside at the back. You could sit inside or outside for as many hours as you wanted to, but I couldn't talk to her in the middle of the jail with people around. It wasn't as easy to talk. And I couldn't tell her stuff in front of Raymond. I wanted to stay for overnight visits, but Mum didn't want this. She thought if I spent too much time there, I'd get used to it. I felt sad when Mum was in prison because everything had changed. But mostly I kept everything in, feeling sad and stuff. I'm always going to remember what happened, that feeling of being on my own.
So I wanted to show that really as an example of some new ways we can think about making research more accessible, more ordinary, and by ordinary I mean human and understandable. And I should say that video was made by a second-year animation design student from the Monash Art Design and Architecture and made in collaboration with Shine for Kids as a way of making research findings kind of available to children, available to workers, and in sound bites, I guess, that people can understand. But Harry's experiences, while individually sad, also reflect what we know of the wider implications of parental incarceration. And again, skipping through these because I know I'm preaching to the converted. We know that experiences and needs are hidden and are often absorbed into larger discussions about grandparent care or child welfare or child protection or alcohol and drug issues. We know that kids typically live with parents before prison and return to their care after. So there's something very ordinary about that. Families are families. We often don't have oversight though, and no planning. We know that kids move to informal care arrangements with extended families, so we know that the burden of care is pushed onto families who are already stressed. We know that those families access limited support systems, and so the problems are further hidden. We know that there's disruption and instability for kids. We know that there are emotional and behavioural difficulties in the short term and in the longer term. And there's a lot that's been said about intergenerational offending, and I cried with joy a little bit when Anne this morning was debunking some of those myths about 6 times more likely to go to prison. I think we need to highlight the risks for kids, but I think we don't need to label them and set a path for them that's not necessarily their path. I tend to think about intergenerational trauma. We know that kids are often silenced, but we also know that some things help. We know that preserving a sense of family helps. And we know, I think, and Madison talked about this this morning, talked about having a positive identity, having connections to the community, having a sense of self that's not just about being labelled as being a child of a prisoner. So I'd say that on the one hand, even though we know a little, and back to that earlier slide about, of the globe, it shows that we often work with guesstimates. We're often we lack a lot of hard data about really, really basic information. But on the other hand, I think we know enough to take some more decisive action, and I guess our challenge is how to make better use of and how to create impact with the research that we do. And if we talk about research impact, what does that mean? the ARC has a really nice definition about demonstrable contribution and contributions beyond academia. So there's this expectation that we create impact in the real world. Now, those of us who work in academia know that that's a bit of a big ask, because the real world is really complicated. There are different groups of people with different priorities, different needs, different ways of thinking, different ways of speaking, who need to be brought closer together. A number of years ago, Shonkov talked about 3 cultures in search of a shared mission. Shonkov talked about science rather than research, but I think these are the key areas. One thing that is missing from this model is families themselves. Why do we not think about what families' role is in all of this? So we need research, we need the information, we need a framework for understanding how to deliver services, and then we actually need to deliver them. But the challenge, as I see it, or one of the challenges, is that everybody works in silos quite often. And we're all a little bit suspicious of other people. And there's a real lack of understanding of what other people's roles are, which is why conferences like this are really fabulous, because it's a real connection of people working in policy and academia and in practice. So we know that from a research point of view, us researchers tend to be requiring evidence and what's the proof, and being quite cautious. And I heard a researcher talking on the radio a little while ago, and she was really saying, look, we're our own worst enemies in lots of ways, because we miss the opportunity for the sales pitch. We tend to go, oh yes, those were the findings, but you know, the limitations are, or but you can't apply it here, and so people end up going, well, did you find anything at all? And so we are our own worst enemies in some ways. From a practice point of view, sometimes practitioners see research as being completely unrelated to what goes on in their field, and hence we need to work much more closely together. So not just that often I hear about people talking about applying research to practice, and I think that's not a really helpful way to think about it as a one-directional thing. I think you need to think about how does practice inform research. And being really mindful of people's practice wisdom. If I look around this room, there's incredible amounts of wisdom based on the work that people do on a daily basis. And we know from a policy point of view that research is probably not the number one priority. Just one point of view, and I have heard some research, and I'm not sure about the basis of this, and it might be more urban myth than research, but that policymakers would listen to a cab driver rather than over a researcher. Quite possibly. But the shared mission... Sorry, I have to apologise for my voice at the moment. I've not been well, and my voice is possibly going to pack up at some point, so if I keep drinking water, I'm sorry. I think we're good on the shared mission. I think we actually have a shared mission, but we maybe haven't got the language for talking about it quite so clearly. I think that the shared mission is clearly that we want well-evidenced, long-term structures, commitment to services and on-the-ground services. That seems pretty sensible. Again, I keep coming back to, and the challenge is how do we prioritise this particular group of children? How do we look at developing knowledge together? We know a few things that work. We know that if we actively target people from the 3 groups, so from policy and practice and research, if we target those people and we bring them into projects, we make sure that we've got representation. That works because partly I think it works because it builds those closer connections. We're less siloed and we actually get to know one another. I think my students often laugh at me because I say I do my best work over cups of tea, and I think I do. I think about all the work that I do and the collaborations that I have, they tend to be over a cup of tea somewhere. It's not really the cup of tea that's important, as you all know. It's the relationship and the trust that goes along with that. Some recent research in America has actually looked at what works in terms of building collaborations, and the key things were looking at trust as being absolutely vital, and the importance of authentic, credible and transparent communication, and mutually respectful and reciprocal relationships. So it's about giving to the relationship, but also about being willing to take something away. Now, I was in a session earlier and the speaker was talking about being an academic and how academics tend to have quite big egos. I think that's very true. I think it's true. We all think we're quite special. I don't think that I'm very special at all, which is probably a helpful position. But I think sometimes the challenge is for academics to not just come in and be fabulous, but to come in and know that we're going to learn something and want to take something away from the people that we work with. I think that's really, really important. I think we need to encourage creativity. We need to think about who are the other people we can work with. Yes, we talked about, psychology, social work. The video from before was made with a colleague from art and design. Not the sort of collaboration I would have immediately thought of. But to think about who else can help us get our message out there. We need to value people's individual input. And I think it's about seeing the long game. And Sir Peter Sharples talked about the journey for different reasons, but I think we actually have to see what we're doing as a journey as well, about, this is not going to get solved in the short term. We have to keep chipping away. Because clearly there are challenges. The challenges are, despite the numbers that we talked about before, this is a really hidden target group. They're hidden under layers of other issues. Finding the key players is really hard, and certainly in Victoria we don't have a peak body for children whose parents are in prison. We also don't have a government department who holds core responsibility, and so the question of whose business is it can be quite hard, and people sometimes like to dodge that responsibility. I would say then we have to push the argument that it's everybody's business. We all know this is not an easy area to work in. It's not politically popular. And as we were talking about in the session earlier, knowledge sharing and knowledge use is not funded. So we do have to think about how we play smart, how we work creatively with other people, how we work with our clever, creative colleagues. I just wanted to talk about one example of it's a number of pieces of work that have come together. I guess I would call it co-creation of academics from different disciplines with practitioners, and also now moving into policy. And I guess it's an example of how a joint project led to other things. Some things along the way, some things are ongoing. But I think what I learned from thinking about this was that we have to take every opportunity to get the message out there. So it started with a PhD study. It feels like a very long time ago now, which then led to a much broader Australian Research Council funded study looking at care planning for children of prisoners. Out of that, we had our community partners say, well, some parts of that are really important. There are things that you need to pay attention to, not just, because we think they're important in our day-to-day practice. And in fact, I recall that conversation, and it might have even been Melanie who raised that issue with us along with other partners. So one of our PhD projects, Alana, who's here today, looked particularly at mothers and mental health. We've been involved with our community partners, including Shine and VACRO, in joint writing, joint articles, conference papers, panels, with all of our academic and community partners. We've looked at developing creative resources, including the one that I showed you just before. Again, with our academic and community partners and new academics. We had a special issue of Law in Context, which looked particularly at the issue of children. And again, these may seem like not, hey, the world hasn't changed, policy hasn't changed, but I think, again, it's the long game. How do we get the issue out there? How do we talk about this more? How do we make this an ordinary issue that people need to care about? We've had our honours students doing research with our community partners, looking at visiting programs, looking at what children identify as assisting the development of their resilience. And it's on the agenda with the Victorian Children's Commissioner for attention this year, and of that I feel very, very pleased. More recently, again, we've had another of our PhD students, Tess, who's also here, doing her PhD looking at particularly at fathers, and that's become a real kind of slow burn in lots of ways, and people are starting to pay attention. So we've now got a special issue of childcare in practice looking at fathers in prison. All of these things are a slow burn, and I think really demonstrates we have to, and I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself, have to think about this as a long game. I'm not a very patient person. Working in this field is certainly teaching me patience. It certainly teaches me patience. And I guess all of us want our research to create immediate impact and immediate change. And I'm reminded, this is a really lovely article by some people who work in the area of knowledge exchange. And it's a good reminder about patience and thinking about what's achievable but being hopeful at the same time. That research use and research impact varies along a spectrum, and that even though we might want to have policy change and things happen up here, sometimes we have to start at the other end. Sometimes we have to work from a more conceptual level, raising awareness, developing knowledge and understanding, changing attitudes and perceptions, and to know that this is a really important part of the work that we do. It's less tangible and it might be frustrating, but it's an important part of the work that we do. And I think some of that awareness and public attitudes that we need to deal with are to stop just talking about the problems. That's not to say that the problems are not real, they absolutely are, but sometimes I think we need to talk about hope and possibility, and the beautiful example of the women's poetry, for me, is a great example of hope and possibility. We're talking about what people can contribute, what they can do, not just what they can't do. We need to frame families as deserving. We need to talk about families and children. I know the correction system struggles to think about families and children, but we are talking about families and children. And we need to think about this as just an ordinary issue that we as a community need to deal with. So there's a few messages in terms of effective sharing of research and making use of findings. I think you have to be realistic about what you're going to do. So sometimes, if you think, well, that nothing's changed, think about what you might have affected at that point of awareness and knowledge and attitudes. Don't over-research. I think we can try and reinvent the wheel a whole lot of times, and I think I've read so many descriptions of children of prisoners. I think I'm done with describing stuff. We all know what the picture looks like. Think about how we can make use of what's available. Think how we can do more with that rather than just repeat that. But I would say to practitioners, and I would say to practitioners who are here, over lunch, over cups of tea, buddy up with people who you think you might like to work with. Think about how you can get involved in doing research, because I think they're the partnerships that make a difference. I think working with advocacy organisations, again about relationships, but for us to know that research is not the key piece of knowledge. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that has to be factored in. Practice knowledge. We have to think about who are the leaders, what credibility, how do we integrate knowledge. I think we do have to go public. I think we have to think about who are the people who can speak with us and for us. I think we have to aim to hit a lot of targets. Sometimes I get tired of talking and writing and then I think, but remember what the aim of this is. Remember that it's about sharing a message. We're all on the same page. We just have to get everybody else on the same page. And I think really importantly, there's taking the time to evaluate what you're doing. Does it actually work? In terms of sharing knowledge, in terms of partnerships. So paying attention to that kind of invisible stuff. So there's been a bit of talk over recent years too about how to reach non-academic audiences. Because, sometimes in academia, they just want you to publish in, A-star journals, and that's great. And the only people who read A-star journals are other academics, which doesn't seem very sensible. So we've got to think about how to reach non-academic audiences. And so thinking about some alternative ways of sharing our scholarly findings, if we want to call them that. And these are just some really interesting examples, I think. So the Economic and Social Research Council have made great use of YouTube, and if anyone hasn't had a look at it, they have a dedicated YouTube channel that has somewhere in the region of about 80 videos directly related to their research funding, and they have all these really cool short and sharp 3 and 4 minute videos that get the message across about a whole range of really interesting things, about programs targeting young people who start fires deliberately, to stop and search laws in Scotland. So it's a really good place to think about, because I keep looking going, okay, I wonder what we could do with that. So to think about how do we get the message out in ways that are accessible to people. Using images, using photo voice, thinking about how you can take your results to the community. How can you write newspaper and opinion pieces? Again, in a university, quite challenging, because those things, they don't care about those things. So from an academic point of view, we've got to think about, well, who can we work with in the community? How can we work together? How can we write stuff together? And again, the community partners that I've worked with, we have written things together, and that's been really, really beneficial. Thinking about what sort of blogs or social media you can actually get involved in. And again, I'm a bit of a Twitter freak, which is quite helpful sometimes. Sometimes it's a bit of a time suck, but people like Hidden Sentence in the US have a real focus on families and children, and they're always seeking contributors. So if you want to get involved, you send them information and they'll share it. So think about how we can make connections. I think, again, this conference is all about how do we make connections. And the LSE put together a cartoon, and this is a bit of an example from it, Tales from Social Care. And again, the aim was to target workers who are always seen to be too busy to read research. And here's a way of putting research in a format that's kind of accessible and makes sense to people. So we've got to think about not just the message, but how we share the message. And there's a bit of an argument, because sometimes people go, oh, but if you do that in 3 or 4 minute videos, or you do an animation, or you do a cartoon, or you do an art show, that trivialises the message. And in fact, there's a really strong argument that says presenting political and social issues in a way, like so hardcore stuff, in ways that's entertaining, actually motivates people. It can motivate people to learn more, to delve more. Yeah, that little video was okay, I'm going to go and read about that now. So don't think about it as trivialising, thinking about it as kind of an opening the door exercise for people. Even things I keep thinking about, how can we work with people in advertising? That's my latest sort of, wonder what I can do with that. And again, in Australia, there was a really interesting advertising campaign recently, Stop, Think, Respect. And it was all about racism, but generated by some really interesting research which highlighted the negative impact on mental health for Aboriginal people of racism in a nice, short, sharp little video that was like a punch in the face in a really good way. So I think how do we think about working with a range of other people is really important. And I don't know, if people have got ideas about advertising, I'm keen to know. But final comments really, take-home messages. Know that it's the long game. That's kind of how it is. Foster and give attention to relationships with people in those other camps. Get to know people in the other camps because they're just ordinary people. I think we do have to think creatively, think about how we share messages. And I think finding champions, finding people who can walk with you and talk with you about these issues is really important. And it is, I think for me, it is that balance of extraordinary and ordinary. How do we make this stuff mainstream so that people care about it? And I wanted to end with some words of somebody who's far more interesting and special than me, Angela Davis, and it was interesting that Tracy mentioned Angela Davis before. I think one of our main jobs is how to ensure that people and issues are made visible. And Anne said something really beautiful this morning about how do we remember that, you know, people are like all others, they're like some others, and they're like no one else at all. And I think this point maybe sums up some of those things. Thank you.